在开始今天这个演讲前，就是要陈兆耀教授我们的中华研院院长是我们这次这些演讲的缘起。
首先当然要感谢我们历史系这期的杨主任答应跟我们陪伴这场演讲。第二个呢是我们有这样机会请到这么杰出的学者来，这也是我们不管是高研院也好，台大也好的荣幸啊。那第三个我就简单说明一下我们这个高研院的第一个宗旨，第二个是系列的大概面貌。那高研院其实非常简单，我们的宗旨就是希望能够以人文价值为基础，然后促进化学科的交流，然后透过这个交流，希望能够找到更多比较另类的给出新材的研究方向。那在我们的所有的活动里面，有一个叫做尖端系列讲座 （Leading Edge Lecture Series）。那么今天的演讲就是在这个系列下面的一个演讲。那这个演讲分成3个区块，也可以说是我们高研院的整个方向的3个区块。第一个就是传统与当代之间的人，第二个是科学与科技之间的人，第三个是迁徙 （migration） 与交杂，也就是 hybridization 之间的人文。我们希望透过这3个区块，然后让我们有机会对这个人文的价值，在我们这个新的时代里面有一个重新的审视以及一个新的开发。好，谢谢。
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, ladies and good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure here to be able to chair this afternoon's speech. And at first, I would like to thank Professor Liao Xianhao for arranging this speech to be given here in our department. And our honorable guest is Professor Haun Saussy. And before Professor Saussy gives a talk, and please allow me a few minutes to give a short introduction of him. And Professor Saussy is a distinguished scholar on comparative literature, and he received his BA in Greek and comparative literature from Duke University, and his PhD from Yale on comparative literature. And he had also studied linguistics and Chinese in Paris. Right? And his teaching and research interests are very wide-ranging, including classical Chinese poetry, literary theory, oral traditions, problems of translations, and so on. Professor Saussy has a brilliant academic career. He joined the University of Chicago faculty in 2011, teaching in the departments of comparative literature, East Asian languages, and social thought. He had previously taught at the UCLA, Stanford, Yale, and the City University of Hong Kong and the University of Paris. And he had also served as the president of the American Comparative Literature Association. And he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. And Professor Saussy's publications include, among others, the Problem of a Chinese Aesthetic, published by Stanford UP in 1993, which is an examination of the questions of language in the early Chinese poetry collections, Shi Jing and Jiu. And Great Wars of Discourse and Other Adventures in Cultural China, published by Harvard University Press in 2001, which is a discussion of the ways of knowing and describing specific to China scholarship. And he also published a number of articles in journals and collections touching a variety of topics such as the imaginary universal languages and of culture, Chinese musicology, 红楼梦and Haitian poetry, 海地诗歌He has cared for the global prose and contemporary art. And today he will give a talk and speak on a very interesting topic, which I suppose was a lot of controversy in the study of Chinese history. The paradox of cultural property, revisiting the new Qing history under comparative auspices, 也会新知识的一些探究。Welcome first.
Thank you. 非常谢谢杨教授，谢谢。你这个介绍完全补充了我所缺乏的虚荣心，而且能够回到台大对我来说是一个大的幸运的事儿。已经30多年没有回到校园里，我曾经在这儿当过一个外国研究生，在那个 IUP 还存在这个国际汉学什么基本，对，我老是忘记那个证明，所以能够回到这个地点，看这些又熟悉又新鲜的风景，而且看到这么多个老朋友跟新的朋友的面目，让我非常高兴。今天我要谈的是新清史，我并不是历史学家，没有那个条件，我就是一个搞文学跟文论的人，而对这个题目有兴趣，可能是有部分是因为那是一个最近在中国大陆被禁止的题目，所以当然就很诱惑我，所以我要强调的是这个比较文化的政策还有文化关系的那个角度，但是从最后要换成英文。A little bit more at home in English, but I just wanted to give a quick sketch of what I'm doing in Chinese, so that those who are not interested in the topic can go find another thing to listen to. So here we go. The first thing I wanted to talk about is a little social media scandal that erupted a few years ago around a cheap. Okay, a few years ago in Utah, a high school senior bought a red silk embroidered dress in a second-hand shop. She was planning to wear it to her high school prom. She thought it looked nice and posted a picture of herself on social media. It didn't take long for the comments to start pouring in. Hundreds, then thousands of comments. A few compliments, but mostly accusations, abuse, and even death threats. She was guilty, they said, of cultural appropriation, of white arrogance. "My culture is not your goddamn prom dress," read one infinitely retweeted example. The kerfuffle provided opportunities for position-taking and vehement statements of principle for cultural property or against identity politics. You know, it's good for people on both sides of that discussion so that they could all be attacked, as our mainland friends like to say. Is it now a settled conclusion that only a Chinese person can wear a qipao in public? I suppose that mothers, friends, and teachers all over America are warning girls to stay away from those lovely qipao unless they have the DNA results to back up their claim to wear it. Cultural appropriation is something that nice liberal people like myself frown upon, although no one really knows what cultural appropriation is or where its limits lie. Wouldn't it be nice if there were some clear rules about it? Well, you have a sense of the examples. Pocahontas costumes and minstrel blackface are definitely out. But will non-Irish be prohibited from celebrating St. Patrick's Day? I suppose it's the sort of thing that is not a problem until somebody objects to it. And no owner of an Irish bar, to my knowledge, is ever interested in restricting participation in beer drinking. But taking offense has become an obsession in America. Americans define their selfhood by the things they are offended by. Will the next ingenious move in the campaign to marginalize gay people be to declare marriage ceremonies, wedding cakes, rings, and so forth products of the heterosexual culture? That's what I was wondering when this business about the qipao was blowing up. Of course, that would be accurate just as a matter of history. Marriage, for centuries and centuries, has always been about having babies. It was a mix of fertility and property. Would this claim of cultural appropriation then trigger protests and lawsuits by straight people deeming themselves harmed by this unconscionable appropriation of their symbols by the queer community? So I thought of this just as a sort of a silly example. You know, this is how extreme this kind of thinking about cultural appropriation might go. And the other day, I started Googling around and discovered that there had indeed been an article that made this claim. A Catholic priest wrote an article called Beyond Expressive Conduct, in which it says that the wedding cake is full of heterosexual symbolism, and the incompatibility of this symbolism with non-heterosexual and non-procreative same-sex marriage makes it wrong for people who are of the same sex and getting married to use a wedding cake. So I thought this was just a joke, but it turns out to be true. Never underestimate the ability of people to come up with a crazy example that you thought was just all your own. Well, in all this wrangling about the ownership of cultural symbols, no one seems to have noticed that the qipao, the banner robe, is not actually Chinese. It is an item of clothing developed on the northern steppe, practical for horse riding people. The high collar protects your throat against the wind, as do the side closures. The slits in the skirt facilitate straddling a horse, and the usually narrow sleeves allow you to draw a bow. Han Chinese clothing is worn by some ethnic identity enthusiasts. Hold on a second, there's a qi. Right? Everybody knows what the qi is supposed to look like. Here is a Manchu lady wearing a real qipao. She's become a little bit taller and thinner in this because of the screen. I think you should patent this. Everybody would like to be taller and thinner in their photographs. And here are some people wearing what is so-called Hanren Fuzhuang. You see how happy they are. Han clothing, as worn by these ethnic identity enthusiasts, is voluminous and tends to be held together by sashes, so it's quite incompatible with the active horse riding lifestyle. If you want to be really particular about it, the qipao is a piece of Manchu culture that has been appropriated by Chinese people in the modern era. And the perfect sign of that appropriation is the fact that nobody remembers that the qipao was Manchu. Nobody, in fact, remembers the Manchus. Now, there are certainly reasons for excluding the Manchus from public memory, not least their complicity with Japanese imperial expansion at the cost of China in the 1930s. The version of Manchu identity that was built up by the puppet state of Manchukuo does not have happy associations for most people today. And quite understandably, it plays no role in the public narratives, images, and genealogies of the modern Chinese states. But avoidance is not the same thing as appropriation. Forgetting this population and culture, or absorbing it into a category of things and people that are simply Chinese, not specifically Manchu, performs a different kind of cultural action. I think that the whole topic of Manchu identity in a historical perspective of some 400 years has a lot to tell us about the uses of culture as an instrument of power. It may have, in fact, too much to tell us about these uses of culture, in the sense that such consideration unveils the device of some contemporary ideologies of the nation. So it is good, even if it may be uncomfortable for some, to think with and about the Manchus. So let's go back to the time when there were Manchus and they were visible. The transition from Qing to Zhonghua Mingguo was led at first by people whose prime concern was not democratic self-government, but ethnic self-rule. People like Zhang Taiyan and Liu Shipei wanted the Manchus out. As a political philosophy, this was not very deep. And once the Manchus were out, the real problems had to be dealt with. What form of government, what type of citizenship, what extent of territory would belong to the post-Manchu Chinese state? If you look at the map of China in 1911, you'll see one result of the initial ethnic emphasis of the Xinhai Revolution. Several areas that later broke away, either permanently, as in the case of Outer Mongolia, or temporarily, as in the case of Manchuria, were recent additions to the empire, acquired by Manchu policy and military combat. Understandably, the prospect of living in a nation in which they would be foreigners, perhaps even second-class citizens, caused unease among Manchus, Mongolians, Turkestanis, and Tibetans. Some significant ideological work had to be done to justify maintaining the border regions and populations within the Zhonghua Minguo and its successor states, after the initial emphasis on ethnic self-rule by the Han. I won't go into the details. In fact, I'm merely mentioning these complex developments for the sake of setting a context, as you surely know all this much better than I do. So, onwards to the new Qing history. Let's see, can I get this to click? There we go. All right. I'm not a historian, but a literary person interested in how history is written and thought about. I tend to think that, as Hayden White argued in his 1973 book Meta-History, that history is written in patterns established by rhetoric and literary genres. And that fact gives me the right to meddle in historical discussions, whether the historians want me there or not. I've been watching for many years as the discussion of the Qing dynasty in the US has evolved. The development has been mainly in extending two kinds of investigation. One, the evaluation of the Qing Empire as an empire, that is, as a superstate consisting of conquered and otherwise acquired alien populations. The other, the analysis of how the Qing used culture, pageantry, and verbal art to publicize the relations between the Manchus and the various peoples they ruled. I think the intersection of these two tendencies offers the greatest potential for reflection. Basically, it is a matter of how culture interacts with power. This isn't just a specialist quarrel. One benefit of thinking hard about the Manchu Imperium is that it distances us from the usual examples that come up when we hear about empire, cultural hegemony, civilizing mission, cultural translation, world literature, globalization, and similar terms. Considering examples that are far enough from the usual ones can help us think more vividly, accurately, and pertinently about big general problems, issues that reach across space and time and language. That's what examples are for. Excuse me for just a moment, because I think I may have jumped over some slides. It sometimes happens, doesn't it? Let's see, how can I go back? No, I'm all right. I just need to go back up now. So, I thought I had some bibliographical references on the slide, but I must have forgotten to copy them down. Doesn't matter. So the study of the Qing in America took a new turn with a lecture given in 1996, Re-Envisioning the Qing by Evelyn Roski, then president of the Association of Asian Studies. She raised questions about the degree to which the Manchu rulers were non-Chinese and how to evaluate their acquisition of Chinese-ness, and quickly elicited a response by Hobing Di entitled In Defense of Sinicization, a rebuttal of Evelyn Roski's Re-Envisioning the Qing. Since then, a number of historians, largely but not solely working in the United States, have drawn parallels between the methods of conquest and stabilization used by the Qing dynasty and those used by the British in India and North America, the Russians in Siberia and the Caucasus, and the Spanish in the New World. Comparison reveals similarities among these empires' military strategies, financial management, religious and cultural interventions, patterns of settlement and land distribution, population control, communications, and so forth, alongside the inevitable differences. For these were empires with distinct heritages operating under conditions that could be vastly dissimilar. Right? So no one is saying that these empires are all identical, but you can benefit from lining them up and noticing the things that they have in common and the things that distinguish them. So the work of Evelyn Roski, James Millward, Mark Elliott, Peter Perdue, and others makes possible long-distance comparisons by drawing attention to the Manchus' connections to the nearby non-Sinitic world, Mongolia, Tibet, Central Asia. As Roski put it in her 1996 address, the new wave involved, I quote, a rejection of the Sinicization thesis and its Han-centered orientation in favor of an empire-building model that emphasizes the importance of the Chinese Empire's cultural links with the non-Han peoples of Inner Asia. So, in fact, if you wanted to think about American historians of China, there were two contrary pulls going on at the same time, right? Who was it? I'm suddenly forgetting his first name. Paul Cohen, just around this time, published his book about the Boxu Rebellion, in which he calls for a China-centered history of China, right? Making a perfectly reasonable argument that people had tended to talk about China as something that was distant and exotic and could be understood only by comparison with Europe and America. So Paul Cohen says, no, absolutely, we need to center China studies on China itself and work out our explanations from the inside, right? Not ask, why was there no industrial revolution in Qing China, but rather ask, how did the Qing manage roads and water and grain transport and so on, right? Questions that were actually internal to that period and that place in those documents. That was one pull. The other pull, represented by Evelyn Roski in this speech, says, well, maybe we're paying too much attention to the Han in Manchu China, and we need to think about Han populations, the traditional 18 provinces, as part of a larger universe of peoples and dynamics and things going on. So here are two pulls that were being exercised in the 1980s and 90s. So this is Roski's contribution, is to say, let's not be entirely Han-centered. Let's think about how the Manchus were connected to the rest of the non-Han peoples of Inner Asia. Because that's one of the things that makes them unusual among Chinese dynasties. Along with administering the former Ming domain, a big enough job for any ruling coalition, the Manchus exploited their existing familial, cultural, and religious affinities with Mongols and Tibetans to extend a variable degree of control over an area of sparsely settled steppes, deserts, and oases, roughly equivalent in size to the provinces of Qing China. Maybe we should go back and have a look at this map, right? Because Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Xizang are the parts of China that were added more or less by the Manchus. And you can see how it really is about half of the total. In blunt terms, they doubled the landmass under the authority of the Emperor of China, who was not just the Emperor of China, but also Grand Khan of the Mongols, chief patron of the Tibetan Lamas, etc. Where the alliances frayed, the Qing sent in troops, and in a series of wars in the middle and late 18th century, they conquered and resettled Central Asian lands previously held by Dzungars, Uyghurs, and Turkestanis, with whom the Manchus, by the way, had no historical ties. Conquest and resettlement are basic components of any imperial history. It should surprise no one that the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, when they could, expanded their domains. Integral to the process were, as well, bloody extermination campaigns and forced migrations. The Dzungars suffered the most. Notably, it is historians able to use sources written in Manchu who have chronicled these events and pieced together the rationale behind the larger geopolitical strategy of the Qing. Hence the label New Qing Imperial History. New in that it relies on documents not previously exploited and treats this early modern empire otherwise than as just one of the traditional 25 Chinese dynasties. The themes of conquest, non-Chinese ethnicity, and strategies of imperial display seem to have hit a nerve among mainland Chinese historians, some of whom have written to denounce the whole school of thought as an American campaign of denigration against China. to compare the Qing dynasty with the Romanov or Ottoman dynasties, let alone the British or French architects of empire, is, according to one exponent of this critique, to 知新清史说的美国学者，站在帝国主义的立场，以帝国主义的观点、帝国主义的眼光看待中国历史，把传统中国看作帝国，把清朝视为清朝帝国主义。在他们的言论与论著中，充述着一股帝国主义的霸气。新清史学术上荒谬，政治上危害中国的统一，必然激起每一个有正义感的学者的强烈反对。How do you like that? I'm sorry, I'm not very good at doing this, fist waving kind of display, right? So that's from an essay by Li Zhiting called 学者评新清史，新帝国主义史学标本。So, the reviewer's objections to the new Qing history must be read backwards, right? Because he's saving the emphasis for last, right? The conclusions came before the evidence, as the questions of territory must be primary and are not open to debate. Scholars in mainland China are explicitly forbidden by current national security law to raise the question of territorial unity. Discussing the events that led to the western provinces and Tibet's being acquired by the Qing dynasty offends against the article of faith, proclaiming that those territories have always been Chinese and must always be so. Worse yet, Uyghurs and Tibetans, who have always been Chinese, might begin, if they read such histories, to think of themselves as forcibly incorporated imperial subjects of recent date. Since every mainland schoolchild knows that China has always and only been the victim of imperial aggression and has never conducted imperial wars of its own, Qing history must obviously be held aloof from the dangers of such comparison. The second reason the new Qing history is bothersome to PRC ideology is that it reads like a prophecy of some aspects of the nationalities policy by which non-Han people are recognized and administered. You can see from these 1950s propaganda posters, let's flip through a little bit. I think I did, there we go. I reversed the order of my slides, I'm sorry about that. You can see from these 1950s propaganda posters how the officially recognized 56 nationalities are imagined as colorful people prone to song and dance, but passive observers of the wave of industrialization and modernization led by the Han Chinese majority. It is said that the Han account for 92% of China's population, which leaves 8% for the national minorities. Were it not for the Manchus, that figure would be much smaller, as most of those 8% would belong to other countries today. This map shows the remaining linguistic diversity of China, where again it is Tibetan and Mongolian that cover the most area, with Miao, Yi, and Dai spoken in islands of the south. Manchu and Korean far up in the north. Chinese remains the primary language of the huge territory, that's mostly the brown part, that corresponds to the Ming Empire before 1644. This map, by the way, shows where languages occur and not where they're spoken by a majority. The homelands of the Uyghurs, the Bai, the Yi, and so forth are often technically known as autonomous regions, but this is a euphemism. Culture is the one domain of autonomy that subsists, and even this is guided from the center. The Manchus ruled remote regions with similar attention to features of culture, such as language, belief, and claims of ancestry. They used multiculturalism as a means of managing diversity, including the management of their most significant population, the Han Chinese. And they maintained many channels of communication with outsiders that enabled them to monitor internal unrest and external risk. Thanks to his teams of translators and advisors, Nurhaci, the founder of Manchu Imperium, knew a great deal more about Ming China than the Ming knew about the Manchus. Recent publications make available the correspondence of Qing organs of government with Ladakh informants and Kazakh sultans, for example. This is a rich field to explore and thoroughly undercuts the stereotype of Qing aloofness and ignorance of the outside world. I find it most unfortunate that scholars living in the PRC are forbidden from exploring analogies potentially relevant to understanding the growth of Qing Empire, and thus, is there any need to say it, the world we live in today. The taboo on exploring the Qing as an early modern empire makes it harder to frame many broader questions about what empire and colony are in general. Is imperialism bad only when Europeans do it? The wartime Japanese tried to sell the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as an end to white domination, but I do not think the skin color of the dominators made any difference to the millions of Chinese victims in the Asia-Pacific War. And so we must ask if the scope of post-colonial studies is wide enough to address all the looming crises of the present. Does the prominence accorded in scholarship to the British and French empires in the Caribbean, India, and Africa harness the moral urgency of anti-imperialism to a narrower in focusing blame selectively? I would like to see historians of empire operate at a scale where no single paradigmatic instance leads the investigation. Rather, when empire is thought of as a form of rule, we see that recurrent devices, variously combined, enable actors to imperialize. And incidentally, there's a useful book by Cooper called Empires in World History that tries to make this form of rule argument. Empires develop similar strategies, they learn from one another, they take over a previous empire's base of operation, even down to the language of official communication, which may be native to neither governors nor governed. That's what happened when the Sogdians appropriated Aramaic, which the Persians had used as their language of correspondence. There is, on the one hand, an accumulated toolkit of methods, the repertoires of imperial power, and on the other hand, the many historical deployments of that ensemble. A broadly comparative history can accommodate neither singularity nor teleology. This is what makes the vocabulary of the toolkit particularly attractive, because a tool, as everyone who's ever tried to repair a home appliance must know, a tool does not always achieve the specific purpose for which it was designed. And tools may be lost, borrowed, or acquired many times in their useful life. Well, having talked about that, having introduced some other languages, we had a brief glimpse of a few of them. I want to lead back to one of my earlier slides. Here we are. So I have another part of the talk called Literary History as a Map of Communications. Goethe said in 1827, "National literature is now a rather meaningless term. The age of world literature is on the horizon." In recent years, world literature has taken on the characteristics of a mission to broaden horizons and show how much cultural diversity there is in the world. With such objectives, I cannot disagree. World literature should be the cosmopolitan answer to national literatures. This is a sphere where cultural appropriation is ostensibly not a problem. But when you move to concrete descriptions and proposals in works of scholarship or pedagogy, the perspective is rather narrower than the word cosmopolitan would lead you to think. Scholars have produced, under the label of world literature, anthologies and histories of publishing that chronicle the rise to world fame of a few authors, typically European, through a process in which strenuous promotion has its part. One example is Pascal Casanova's World Republic of Letters. We have histories of the world novel. We have histories of economic globalization lightly made over as cultural history. These histories typically start in 1492 with the exploration of the New World by Columbus. In other words, the culture they reflect is European, and their version of cosmopolitanism is the extension of European culture to new continents. While the tendency to Eurocentrism among advocates of world literature has not gone unnoticed, counterblasts have often been framed in the same terms. So we have efforts to build up a literary canon of the global South, a category that exists simply because of a polarity with the global north. To be absurdly brief about it, I would say that accounts of world literature typically begin with people thinking they know what the world is, always in the singular, the world, and that they know what literature is. I would like to frame a project that seeks to find out what those things are, instead, to find out what they have been or what they can be by mapping the flows of cultural information over a longer period of time and space. Literature intrinsically involves communication. Where you have writers and readers, you have the beginnings of a shared world. I get my notion of world from the sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who says that a world is simply the available horizon of communication for the people who live in it. So if there are living creatures on Mars, they're not part of our horizon yet, but if they came here and began dealing with us, we would be in the same world. So literature involves communication. That's what makes literature into a world. I think it's more promising to construct the world out of the literature than to start with a given world and see how literature behaves in it. Since there are many readerships, then there must be many such worlds. National literary histories try to define you to one such world. These national literary histories may be well argued, well documented, full of intelligent choices and judgments, but they have a common tendency to overemphasize the national heritage and to downgrade or ignore whatever came into the national literary heritage from outside. Right? And so here's my job as a comparatist, is to upgrade the connections with the outside and try to call them into prominence. By that, I mean not only translation, but the presence of minority groups, domination and conquest by outsiders, influences carried by religion or technology or commerce or simple proximity. My current mission, perhaps an unrealistic one, is to organize a group of scholars capable of writing a cross-border, non-national, multilingual history of the literatures of Asia, from the invention of writing to the 19th century. Up to the 19th century, because after that point, the game changes considerably. Today's talk is in fact one exploration of some themes in that projected history, and it's also an invitation to any of you who are interested in participating in this history to be in contact with me. Now, the literary history of Asia is, as a whole, is multilingual, but it's not indifferently multilingual. There are centers and peripheries. There are major languages and minor ones. There are languages with a written archive and languages dependent on a community of speakers. Some texts are seemingly shared by everybody in the Asian space, and some interest only a narrower community. The main fact about East Asian literary exchanges is the supranational, indeed imperial role played by China and Chinese canonical literature. Over a long history, China is the main partner, the central participant in cross-border culture, though it does not engage in the same way with all participants. Many of the participating cultures are in contact with one another only through China rather than directly. The means of connection is, most of the time, through the Chinese written language. That writing system was, in almost all areas of the continent, the first one to be known and the one in which the history of many non-Chinese peoples was first written. Here's a very sketchy map. Sketchy, but possibly useful. We can call the area where Chinese was both written and spoken Zone A, right? That's the zone bounded in green. Hold on. I'm sorry, this is a different version of the map. Well, okay. Within that green, the green is actually Zone B, sorry. Zone A is within Zone B, and you can yourselves draw the map of, draw the circumference of the area where Chinese is both written and spoken. The areas where Chinese is written but not spoken is Zone B, and that I've approximately indicated with the green line. Histories of Chinese literature nowadays usually include a chapter on Chinese outside China, Sino-Japanese, Sino-Korean, Sino-Vietnamese, and other traditions of literary composition where classical Chinese was used by people who did not speak Chinese. Hanzi were a common symbol set coexisting with different vernaculars. the symbol set was only partially and tentatively aligned with the spoken languages. Yet the symbol set was self-sufficient as a language and gave entry into the great Chinese conversation. In that sense, the Chinese written language is cosmopolitan. It is bigger than the Chinese Empire itself. In anthologies of poetry and essays from dynastic China, we find compositions by Koreans, Japanese, and Vietnamese, who even competed in the Chinese examination system and came away with official titles. There was, you could say, a republic of letters to which all were welcome, all men at least, if they had the requisite education. But the zone of Chinese character circulation needs to be further differentiated. For after some centuries of using Chinese for administrative, poetic, religious, and other elite forms of recording and communication, the countries that had adopted it then developed writing systems of their own, of which you see some very paltry samples here. The Japanese developed hiragana and katakana, which they used side by side with Chinese. The Koreans invented 2 or 3 phonetic writing forms before settling on the version that we now know as Hangul in the 16th century, more or less. The Vietnamese devised a script using Chinese characters that is, I believe, unreadable by Chinese people, but that reflected the pronunciation of their own language. Literary composition went on in these new writing systems. Very distinguished compositions, if you'll remember The Tale of Genji and The Pillow Book, for example. But these works were never translated and read by the Chinese before the 20th century. Poems, essays, letters, and novels in classical or vernacular Chinese were quite enough for the Chinese market. So although the Chinese character enabled communication with other countries, that communication was layered. There was one level specialized in certain types and styles of writing, where classical Chinese was de rigueur. Here's my rough map of how it goes. The big yellow circle is the conversation of China with itself. Right? Everyone writing in classical Chinese, no matter what province you live in, and passing those texts along. Then there's another yellow arrow representing classical Chinese going out to other states that use Haun or Kanbun for their official and administrative and philosophical and basically high culture communication. The classical Chinese, though, then spins off a tradition of vernacular writing in the katakana and hangul and so forth, which circulates within each of these countries, but it's a smaller circle and it doesn't flow back to China. That's the smaller red circle with an arrow in it. So it's a layered, differentiated communication. There's one level specialized in certain types and styles of writing where classical Chinese was de rigueur, and then there was a level where vernacular writing, or a mix of vernacular and Chinese, tended to be used. And although Chinese writing was an international medium of communication, the vernacular scripts were not. Classical Chinese has often been called the Latin of the East. For Chinese in the pre-modern world, it certainly was the world language. It was the language of the horizon of communication that defined their world. But there's a lot that passed them by, a lot that was part of the world, but not part of their world. We know the limits of their interest because we can see what was translated or adapted between which languages. Vietnamese, Japanese, and Koreans, for instance, translated and adapted works of Chinese fiction into their own vernaculars, creating many works that are now classical in those languages. But the converse didn't happen. The limitation of classical Chinese as an international language was that the conversations it sparked, though they were immense, were often one way. And then there are the vast zones that were in contact with China for millennia, but did not accept the Chinese character in classical language texts. Here, let's go back a bit to this little illustration. Oh, there we go. Let's call them, for simplicity, Zone C. And here I've represented it with a Sogdian text, a Tibetan text, and a Mongolian text. The bicycle is not part of the text. So these, so Zone C, represented by these Central Asian and North Asian writing systems, are certainly under Chinese influence, but linguistically apart. Zone C divides into different languages and alphabets. China is not the major reference point for the religious, literary, and cultural productions of Tibet, Central Asia, and Manchuria. Different channels of circulation and translation were active. Tibetans translated texts directly from India, not only the Buddhist doctrinal works that you might expect, but also epics and wisdom literature. There was a Tibetan paraphrase of the Ramayana, for example, already in the 10th century, and Tibetan poetry was composed according to Indian models, not Chinese. Before Mongolian and Manchurian had writing systems of their own, Tibetan was often used as the writing system for communications with those areas. To write the literary history of these three zones, then, Zone A, B, and C, is to talk about parallel channels, distinct conversations that meet only rarely and briefly. The Manchus come into the story again here, for it is they who added to China the regions, amounting to about a third of the country today, despite losses, of the vast north and west. They could do this, I think, because they were not Chinese. This is where the territorial dimension of the new Qing history meets the cultural dimension. For in addition to their military prowess, the Manchus were adept channel switchers. Hold on, let's go back quickly to the big map. So, as you can see from the now familiar map, the zones most recently added to Qing China, Inner and Outer Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang, are also the zones where the Chinese character is not the traditional means of communication. The Mongol and Manchu languages have their own writing system, derived ultimately from Syrian and Aramaic. The Uyghurs today have a version of Arabic script. They used to have different scripts of their own. The Tibetan script derives from Indian prototypes. It was not in the long-established canons of Chinese empire to subdue people who wrote. People who wrote Chinese were already civilized and needed no subduing. Barbarians who needed subduing typically did not write. I think of the Xiongnu and others. Zone C is where China met other literate empires, Tibetan, Persian, Kuchan, Russian, and so forth. Who communicates with whom? Who reads, translates, writes to whom? Who learns whose written language? Who avoids whom? How are or aren't they part of a world? The multiculturalism of modern-day China is largely a creation of the Manchus 300 or so years ago. But it has lived on into an era of forced integration that was not usually the Manchu way. Ruling as a small minority, a huge empire that they made bigger by conquest and alliance, the Manchus had to be flexible and clever. The Qing seem to have understood their sovereignty as an ability to switch between and coordinate their different roles. Emperors in Beijing, Grand Khans in Mongolia, honorary lamas in Tibet. This channel switching ability is epitomized by the Qianlong Emperor. I have a couple of famous pictures here. I think you know him here as a bodhisattva wearing a Tibetan Buddhist abbot's hat and making gestures of blessing. Here's another of Qianlong's accomplishments. When the Toguts, the Tuar Huta, came back to China in 1771, after having spent 2.5 centuries in Russia, he received them very grandly in a yurt. You see he's got a nice Mongol balk over there, and the Tuar Huta are lining up to be treated to a Mongol dinner. It's a Mongol-style dinner. So these are just a couple of indications of how the ability to switch between identities was very important for the Qing in their need to coordinate the different parts of their empire, but keep them distinct. They weren't interested in simply putting everybody in a blender and pushing a button. Right? They didn't want everybody to be alike. It was actually to their advantage if everybody was not alike, and it was the Manchus who had the keys to the different codes that enabled one to communicate with them all. The Manchus had access to the Chinese world as bilinguals and as translators, and they participated in the other sub-areas of Zone C through ties of kinship, religion, or diplomacy. Uniformity of behavior and belief was not desired. Coordination was what mattered, and that is what the Manchus were good at. Multilingualism and multiculturalism were for them not just a matter of tolerance, as we often hear in Europe, but an affirmed policy and means of legitimation. And there's a famous statement by the Yongzheng emperor, isn't there, about how everybody is part of one big family in the Manchu Empire, but that didn't mean that everybody had to do exactly the same thing. The Manchus communicated with everybody. That was the key to their power. Their handling of the outlying areas recognized cultural, religious, and political difference in precisely the way that the present-day Chinese state, with its insistence on uniformity and assimilation, which has become particularly strong in the last decade or so, in precisely the way that the present-day Chinese state cannot do. One example of the Manchu strategy of multiple bilingualism makes a rare connection between the literary traditions of Tibet and China. As usual, it's a clever and ambiguous connection. In 1792, the Nepalese attacked Lhasa and were beaten back by a quickly summoned Manchu army of 70,000. Tibet, as you'll remember, has been under Qing military protection since 1721, and the Manchus professed fealty to the variant of Buddhism expounded by the Tibetan Lamas. Nepal was officially a Qing tributary state. Right, so we're dealing with border peoples and border ways of belonging here. In commemoration of his victory, the Qianlong Emperor built a, the Qianlong Emperor built a Chinese-style temple on a spur of the same mountain where the Potala Palace stands. Maybe you visited this little temple. It is dedicated to Guan Yu, to Guangong, exactly, the deified hero of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a historical novel about the civil wars of the 3rd century of our era. You often see the red-faced warrior in Chinese shops and businesses because he's become kind of a national protector figure, and particularly a protector of Chinese abroad. But Guan Yu has no particular meaning for Tibetans. The temple was designed for Chinese soldiers posted in Tibet, and the imperial inscription there memorializes the victory over the Nepalese as a Chinese victory. But the Manchus very cleverly designated it as a temple dedicated to King Gesar, the hero of the Tibetan epic, as well. And they referred to Gesar temples, which are found throughout Tibet, as temples of Guandi. One war god was equivalent to another, although the two individuals, Gesar and Guandi, had lived at least 1,000 years apart. And here they are on the altar of the Guandi temple. You know, they're having tea together. It's a great meeting of the minds. So everybody knew that these two individuals are distinct, but they're treated as if they're synonymous. Right? Here, a bit of syncretism has been summoned up to blur over a long-enduring rivalry. For Gesar, if you consult the enormous epic composed about him in the Tibetan tradition, frequently conducts raids on China, sometimes in retribution for betrayal by Chinese leaders. Of course, no Chinese ever bothered to listen to the Gesar epic. This is Manchu multilingualism at work, fluid at changing registers and establishing metaphorical equivalences, rather like the skills we stress in comparative literature. Today, we see a China that has been incorporated into a different world, one where the Europeans and North Americans have been the loudest speakers for the last century and a half, and where Chinese readers, writers, and textbook publishers have replaced their old literary world with a new literary canon drawing on translated English, Russian, Japanese, German, and French primary texts, as well as Chinese ones. But like old foundations that can be seen from the air, the organization of the literary world into its Chinese-speaking, Chinese reading, and non-Chinese speaking and reading zones, that is, zones A, B, and C, this organization of the literary world remains and needs to be rediscovered. The Manchus are among the unacknowledged makers of the modern world. That may be why it's so convenient for everybody to forget about them. They brought the Tibetans and Uyghurs into China, but did not demand the degree of integration and assimilation that those people are, according to present-day Han Chinese enforcers, failing to satisfy. The Manchu Empire was based on a model of the management of differences that the era of ethnically defined nations abandoned. Right? Think of the Wilsonian doctrine about how a nation is supposed to be. The era of ethnically defined nations abandoned that model of uniform, the era of ethnically defined nations abandoned the model of the management of differences in favor of uniform and undivided sovereignty with weak and symbolic protections for minorities. To frame a more truly cosmopolitan future for East Asian culture would be on the extreme ends of the consequences that one might envision for this literary history project, but I don't think it's impossible to at least point in that direction. I wish to draw a lesson for culture and identity generally. When we speak of cosmopolitanisms, a caveat is in order. Some contemporary scholars denounce cosmopolitanism as an ideology designed to prolong Christian and Eurocentric conceptions of the world. I acknowledge this critique as a warning well worth heeding. Of course, no so-called world culture or so-called cosmopolitan sensibility is ever adequate to the name. The cosmopolises we can imagine always arise, it seems, in the shadow of an empire. The Stoics were able to imagine themselves as citizens of the world because the Caesars had done the dirty work of making aliens into Romans. So when someone says world literature, it's important to ask which world, whose world it is meant to be the literature of. That is to say, whose world order. There's the world order of the Mongols, of the Manchus, of medieval Christendom, of mercantilism, of the Berlin Conference, of the United Nations, and so on. Worlds are made, not found. They are often made by literary texts, which complicates the job of inserting the literature in the world when the opposite might make for an easier fit. Moreover, a work may outlast the world it was made for. Since comparative work is able to call on the whole range of time and space available to the human species, it's essential that we learn to switch among the different ways of ordering the world, rather than accepting the present situation as the world. The Qing way of organizing diversity can offer one practical model of how this has been done. And that's why I'm grateful to the historians who have produced the new Qing history. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for this very thoughtful and inspiring talk. I think we have about an hour for you to raise questions. And you may raise questions either in English or in Mandarin.
Either way is good. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Oh, thank you. It's a wonderful talk, and it helped me a lot because I was just reading your new book, How We Come Early Yet, and this is obviously part of the project. But I have to be honest, as a modern Chinese, listening to a talk, very refreshing and inspiring talk, but it generates very mixed feeling. Let me express my mixed feeling in terms of the past, the present, and the future. If we really listen to your talk and we really follow your proposal, then when we look at the present, then, for example, we should probably engineer a whole restructuring of our Chinese literature department. Because in terms of your definition of East Asian literature or Chinese literature, then the modern Chinese, the modern department of Chinese literature is totally it's totally outrageous. I mean, it's that kind of comparison, even probably for our comparative literature program. It's that kind of comparatives that you describe in your book that it really really don't want comparison. They just want confirmation of the uniqueness of their own ethnic literature. So it made me sad. Make me sad. But on the other hand, your talk makes me, what's the word? Sort of nostalgic. Wow, I've never heard such a beautiful description of the Qing dynasty. It almost made me regret that we Republican China should not have overthrown that dynasty. It was multilingual, it was multicultural, and the mental way is such a wonderful way of management of managing the difference. Wow. That's really a new Qing, new perception of it. But it's interesting, and I do admit it makes sense to a great extent. But what makes me part of the mixed feeling is it made me worrisome. Because according to the beautiful picture you paint for the Qing Empire, or at least as a point of departure for the future empire study, not only studying the Qing Empire, but probably we can also bring some new light on some other European or other empires of other ethnic origins. But it makes worrisome that it could, in a very ironic way, the new Qing history as you described could actually help or facilitate what we see as part of the rise of China, the Chinese stream discourse. What I mean is that if the Qing dynasty is so beautiful, or probably, and if we re-examine it and then we granted the credit the dynasty deserves as the maker of the participant of the global modernity, then it actually helped the People's Republic to give them a new model to follow in the Chinese lineage of dynastic models. And if they are well into, through the Ming Dynasty model, which is a more Han-centered, more inertia dynasty, and they pick up this wonderful Qing mental way, would you not say, or would we not say, it's probably sort of a better model for the emerging global community, even better for the American empire? I'm trying to be a little drastic and dramatic here. But how, as you point out in your book, are we comparing yet? Comparison itself is not only an intellectual game. It's not only about, as Haun said, applying your categories. It's also an ethical act. So how would you describe your own positionality on this sort of reconfiguration, reimagining a new Qing empire? What's its ethical dimension or possible for future global community? It's a huge and ironical question.
Yeah. Thank you. That's an extremely stimulating question. I'll try to improvise some answers. One is that I'm not actually calling for anyone to restore the Qing dynasty, although, it's got some advantages to it, right? One is that that multilingualism is something that the Qing were always putting forth and being very proud of. I've just given one of these typical little quadrilingual inscriptions that's always there as a reminder of how powerful they were through being fluent in multiple idioms that most people knew only one of. Right? I guess multilingualism is for me like a drug. As soon as I see it, I like it. So it may have disarmed my critical sense. Also, the idea of a form of multiculturalism that doesn't reduce things to a common denominator, right? Is not just a matter of toleration, where people are obliged to sort of shear off most of what makes them distinctive in order to participate in a community. That somewhat ghettoizing device that the Qing were using in order to stay on top and to keep control of everything, you know, it too is not perfect. If we were going to revive that, we'd want to do it in a way that doesn't require a group sitting on the top and exploiting difference. But the notion, which I think has had a century now, we're in 2019, we're just after, you know, we're just completing 100 years since Woodrow Wilson's attempt to remake the map of Europe by parking each nationality within secure borders where everybody would be the same as their neighbor. That model, I think, has not served everybody very well. Right? In Europe, the notion of the European Union, which is, of course, under attack today by exactly these kinds of ethnocentric, xenophobic interests, right? But the European Union, I see, as a great ideal where somebody can create a kind of a meta-national or a supranational entity in which states can participate without losing their autonomy, and in which people, individuals, can have a degree of mobility and educational opportunity and, you know, work opportunity that they could never have if they had to stay within the boundaries of their own state. I guess maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I really find something very, very appealing in that European ideal. So let's say, if if I had the magic wand and could be reorganizing world order, you know, after the Mongols and the Manchus and Woodrow Wilson, now comes on Saussy's world order, it would look something like the European Union with a little dose of Manchu multilingualism, perhaps. So, you know, that's the set of interests that prompt me to see something beautiful about the Manchus, who of course were not perfect. They did all kinds of terrible things, like all of these empires, but they confronted multilingualism and they didn't really try to reduce it to one. That's the degree of nostalgia. It's a very tempered nostalgia. It's by no means an unconditional nostalgia. Perhaps I'm speaking in a self-interested way because it would be very hard for me to grow a long queue off the back of my head today. And you know, would such a polity serve Chinese dream discourse? You know, there it gets interesting and subtle and complex. And you know, I'm not an expert really in the difference between the ideology and the actual policies that are being pursued by the current external policy of the PRC. But it does look to me as though a lot of the Bridge and Road initiative is meant to reduce people to dependency and and to hobble the free action of many of the states that are incorporated into what looks at first like a wonderful network of increased communication and, you know, funding and all kinds of stuff. It also turns out that that a lot of these states have engaged themselves in horrible debt traps and will be losing out from it. So there, you know, the Chinese dream might have a kind of a two-facedness, right? That I think something like a freely entered into community of states, like, you know, that good old European Union, would be a good response to. So I think that is how I might try to season the soup a little bit differently, and I would hope comfort some of your mixed feelings about this set of ideas. Finally, the point that you begin with, that national literature departments, I actually do think that national literature departments could do with a bit of reorganization, because they are creations of the 19th century. You know, the French and the Germans are the first to set them up because they have a cause to push, right? It's all about the national glory. It's about finding authors of genius with whom students can identify and building a national literary canon where everything in it derives from something earlier and doesn't derive from something outside it. And the English were a little bit late to this game because Oxford and Cambridge weren't interested in English literature, so you know, it took a while. But when English literature became a university subject, it too tended to emphasize the relation of English speakers to English speakers and to downgrade the amount that Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton owed to people who wrote in other languages. In fact, if I may dip into an anecdote, what made a comparative literature person out of me is a traumatic event. In my first week of college, I went to the Milton seminar of some famous guy in the English department at Duke, and I was sitting in the back row waiting for the great man to arrive. And I heard some grad students complaining about having to take a French reading exam. One of them said, "I came here to study English, not French." And, you know, little 17-year-old me thought, wait a minute, you know, John Milton read Greek and Latin and Syriac and German and Italian and everything he could get his hands on. He'd read everything in the library by the time he was 16. He didn't care about learning foreign languages. That didn't scare him at all. So I just got up right then. I never heard the guy's Milton seminar. I went to the Greek department and I said, I want to take first year Greek. And so they accepted me, and later my Greek teacher told me about comparative literature, where you could do more things at
You
once.
were very precocious, 17 years old.
I think I was just short-tempered and arrogant. But anyway, it was, you know, it was wonderful. I'm actually kind of grateful to those graduate students, although I probably would say that they're jerks for not wanting to learn French. But anyway, so we, you know, when you're in a culture that thinks of itself as peripheral, that thinks of itself as central, monolingualism tends to be the norm, and foreign languages are just bothersome distractions. But for that reason, it's all the more important for people who are in a big culture that talks mostly to itself to learn the other languages and be obliged to talk to other people. And here, you know, here's one thing that the Manchus didn't do, and which I, if I were emperor, would try to do. They didn't require their Chinese subjects to learn Manchu. You know, they didn't really push Manchu on anybody else. They liked to have a private channel of communication. They were very suspicious of officialdom. Well, you know, if I were running things, I would want there to be more communication between Chinese and Manchu, for example. You know, I don't know what unanticipated consequences that might lead to, but there it is. Anyway, so yes, I should absolutely put in a paragraph or two addressing these very, very sharp and perceptive mixed feelings. Thank you.
Partly following up Professor Song's question, when I learned that you study literature more than you do New Qing history, I expected that you might be talking about something like whether the Tibetans read Hong No Meng as much as the Manchurian elites did, some questions like that. But actually today you talked much more about power politics. How did the Qing government or the Manchurian government govern so many ethnics via such a meticulous linguistic policies? So I wonder, first, how do you define the word literature? Because when you say literature, I expect to hear about Hong No Meng, not about these edicts written in Tibetan, written in Mongols, and written in Manchurian. And second is that, what was the reaction of these ruled people? That is, while the Manchurians didn't want these Mongolians to learn Chinese, to learn Manchurian, they want them to just read the Mongolian edicts and follow my orders, that's all. What did the Mongolians, what did the Tibetans think? Did they even try to learn Manchurian, learn Chinese to their own advantage so that they can come to the extent of tricking the emperor? Thank you.
Yeah, that's very good. The published writings in Manchu, you know, a lot of it, well, I don't actually read Manchu, although once in a moment of optimism in a used bookstore, I bought John Fairbanks' Manchu Reader. I thought I was going to learn it. Well, maybe if I live long enough, I will learn some Manchu. But actually, Hong No Meng is one of the things that got me into this whole thing. And I'll tell you how. Everyone has always suspected that there must be an early version of Hong No Meng in Manchu, right? Because so many of the things that go on in that book are specific to Manchu culture, but are closed in Chinese terms. And so if people are familiar with Manchu culture, it's like reading that novel with a kind of an X-ray. They can see the bones that are invisible to other people. So that's always been a curiosity of mine, right? How is it different when you see it that way? But the second thing is something that struck me all along about Hong Lou, and that's a feature of its construction. It's a book that is constantly parodying other genres of writing, like edicts, for example, prescriptions, right? Sermons, classroom teaching. Right? Sometimes the characters sit down and read a page of Zhuangzi, and then they can't resist writing an imitation of Zhuangzi. There's something kind of crazily imitative about that novel, where there's a really fine poetic, almost a Joycean kind of parody that's going on in it. And as a non-Chinese struggling through Hong Lou years ago, this is one of the things that made it difficult and exciting for me, because I would be reading along and suddenly the register of language would change. And I would have to learn a whole new vocabulary that went with this or that type of writing that I'd never confronted before. I don't think there are any other novels in the Chinese canon that are so chameleon-like, right? That are always mocking and mimicking things that are not typically the novels. And I've always wondered, does this have something to do with this Manchu talent for mimicry and for code switching? This is a totally speculative thing, but as always, it's probably the real motive for me getting interested in New Qing history, the notion that perhaps I could find some kind of a clue to this extraordinary stylistic diversity that we have in that wonderful book.
The New Qing history scholars would appreciate the support of your firepower, and as a sympathizer of the New Qing history myself, I'll offer you some firepower too. First of all, there are some great scholars, great colleagues of mine, who think that the revolution of 1911 should not have ever happened, because that put China in a chaos of half a century, and that led to the rise to power of the communists. Again, that put China into a big trouble. So, but let's see that as a joke, as a lament. But I would think that the advantage of the New Qing history are two. First of all, is historiographic. It corrects the assumed continuity and homogeneity of Chinese history that have been practiced for centuries, and especially in the last half a century, for example. And in that regard, it calls scholars' attention to the multicultures and the ethnic diversity of Qing China and before. And second is it relativizes what its advantage. Its advantage is relative, in the sense that in today's China, there's only a certain way of being Chinese, and if you don't fulfill that way, you are in prison. And in that sense, it seems ethical to advocate a more tolerance of Chinese ways of being Chinese, or to protest or to challenge the orthodox way, the orthodox view of Chinese. But of course, Qing China is not perfect. The one problem that is shared by today's China that is it seems so complacent, or it seems so self-centered. And last year, at the height of the trade war between China and the U.S., and the Chinese authorities banned the celebration of Christmas, for example, and they only wanted national holidays and no foreign influences, no foreign holidays at all. And this seems obvious in the 18th century when Qianlong, when the Chinese emperor wanted the the English delegates to kowtow to him, and now they wanted to do that again to foreign forces, and so this seems common between Qing China and today's China, and there's still similarity continuing. And one question though, one of my colleagues who do maritime history has never been fond of the New Qing history because he thinks that their approach really overlooks the influence from the sea. And what's your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair call because the Yu Qing history is mostly about the relation with Central Asia, right? So naturally, it's about places that you can get to on horseback and not on dolphin back. But so yes, it's got its myopia built into it. There's of course, for the last few centuries, a lot of the relations of China with the outer world that happened by sea happened almost, in secret, not quite illegally, but certainly sort of outside the law, right? It's, everybody remembers the terrible story of the Chinese who were massacred in Malacca. And I think the Qianlong emperor said, well, serves them right, they shouldn't have left China anyway, right? So, it shows the unofficial nature of that communication with the outside world by the water. It was certainly a blind spot in Qing policy too, of course, because the influences that were eventually going to undermine them didn't come from their northwest frontier. Their northwest frontier they were very good at managing, even though they had to fight a lot of wars there. It was their southeastern seacoast that caused the problems for them. So that is certainly a bias of the New Qing history. I could, though, add something in favor of that bias while recognizing it as a bias, and that has to do with the notion of empire, because as long as the British and French empires are kind of the canonical cases of empire, the one that you think of first when you say the word empire, they have a certain disadvantage because they're seaborne, right? So people are getting in boats and sailing off to somewhere in the New World or in Asia, and then fighting to establish a colony and send over inhabitants and settle it and so forth, right? It happens in Asia and Africa and elsewhere. There's a kind of a built-in difference between the colonizers and the colonized that is extreme, Columbus landing in the New World, there's no common language, there's no common history, and that in the eyes of the colonizers, unfortunately, legitimated a great deal of violence and bloodshed, right? Think about, in contrast, a land empire. Let's talk about Russia instead of Qing China. There, because the empire is propagating over land, you're going through inhabited territory, and you're in a kind of a continuum of cultures and languages. If you're going from Moscow to Chuvash country to the Caucasus, in every village they're speaking a different dialect, but they can speak the same, they can communicate with people in the villages around them. Right? So maybe from Moscow to Tbilisi, there's a huge cultural difference, but it's bridged by all these smaller human communities. That's the experience of land empires, and sort of see that going on the northwest frontier of China. And it just culturally, it has a very different feel. Right? So I would say that although Qing studies should not neglect the sea, there's an advantage of the lack of emphasis on land empire that is something to be perhaps compensated for.
Well, thank you, Haun, for the wonderful lecture. I would like to ask about the sense of roots and rootedness in the Qing imagination of the world, and especially with regard to the centrality of Manchu within the space that was created for multilingual communication and exchange. And I think while the Qing provided space for multilingualism and multilingual communication, there is no question that Manchu held the most important and special position within that world. And Chen also emphasized the importance in the 18th century, and then they also tried to polish the grammar of the Manchu language so that everybody should be clear about their own Manchu identity within the Manchu bureaucracy, not outside that special group. But I think one of the arguments that was put forward by the New Qing historians is this idea of attachment to the centrality of Manchu. Even in the late 19th century, the Qing never abandoned this idea of Manchu identity and the critical importance of the Manchu language, Manchu culture. And so I was wondering if you could speak about this sense of roots within the Qing imagination of the world, and to what extent that sense of rootedness can be compared to other worlds that we see, and then the way in which those other worlds corresponded or interacted with roots in other contexts.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Well, the Qing had a very hard time keeping traditions within their own group. You know, the people progressively forgot Manchu, and they forgot the arts of archery and horse riding, and so a lot of Manchu noblemen were basically completely urbanized. And also in the Northeast, the homeland that was supposed to remain originally preserved for the old Manchu way of life was more and more occupied by people who are farming it as intensely as in other parts of China. Right? So those kind of protectionist policies didn't stand the test of time very well. Right? There was always emphasis on them, but it was a little bit like, you know, the parent telling the child, you must do this, and the child not doing that at all. But there definitely was an attempt all along to refine and perfect the Manchu language through grammars and dictionaries and so on. I know about this only at second hand. But one of the odd facts about Manchu is that so much of the literature was translated. Right? So that must give a particular flavor to Manchu writings, because Nurhaci insisted on having all the major works of Chinese civilization translated into Manchu. Something that the Jesuits were very happy about, because Manchu is a lot easier to read than classical Chinese. And so they would tend to actually rely on the Manchu paraphrases when they were reading the Sishu and so on. I think this is something that I need to learn more about, right? What are the intellectual movements happening within the Manchu language, and what are the schools of thought, and what are the interests that people are identifying? I have a little sense of how intellectual history is dealing with language in Chinese and a few other languages, but I don't quite know how it works in Manchu. So that is fascinating, right? Because building up a literary canon and defining what purity of grammar and correctness of usage are, this is very basic to the idea of a nation, especially for pre-modern people, right? When nations like France and England and so forth are just sort of emerging out of a linguistic chaos or out of situations of diglossia, where the bureaucracy might write in a completely different language from the language spoken on the streets, right? So that in other countries, anyway, the national language, what the Manchus in fact called Guoyu, for many centuries the term Guoyu means Manchu language rather than what we call Guoyu here. That's got to be an important part of Manchu cultural politics. I just don't know about it. I can improvise something and give you a list of questions, but that's all I can do. So I thank you for that. That's a great suggestion. Yeah.
Hi. Saussy, haven't seen for quite a long time.
好久不见。
Yeah, 好久不见. It's great.
你意思为变。
Well, I'm afraid I cannot agree with you at this point.
我看精神，不看外形。
Thank you very much. I would say at this special occasion, I also would say I bring some of the thought to your speech, because I also have very complex feelings and thought toward your speech. on one hand, I would say it's wonderful for you to reinforce the, I would say, the importance of the multi-linguistic, multi-dimensional, I would say, policies of the Manchurian to deal with all these cultural and literary affairs. It's wonderful to bring that to our attention. And I would say modern China definitely was built on the foundation of the Manchurian conquest and the Manchurian Empire. So we have to keep that in mind. If we want to rule China, we have to learn a lot from Manchurians, okay? And I often, as a historian, I also write something about that in the also to talk to my students. We have to learn a great deal from Manchuria. But on the other hand, I would say, the modern Chinese doesn't like the Qing Empire. They, at the same time, they think it is one of the most despotic, autocratic, imperialistic, and I would say oppressive dynasty in Chinese history. I would say it's very open, and very, multidimensional in many ways. At the same time, it's very despotic, very autocratic. And of course, you can say it's part of the reason. I would say it's connected to it's an empire. It's different from the Ming Dynasty, for example. You cannot say Ming Dynasty is really an empire because it does not keep colonies.
Yeah,
Okay? It's difficult.
The Qing is definitely a conquest empire, and that's not what the Ming is about. Yeah, that's true.
And many historians are beginning to, reconsidering that. And when did we begin to call China as an empire? Because some historians did some research, like the New Qing historians. Okay, they said that probably before 1800, something like that, Western people called China as a kingdom, not as an empire.
Yeah, Matteo Ricci calls it Il Regno della Cina, the kingdom of China. Yeah.
That's true. So traditionally Chinese does not consider China as an empire. Okay? And I would say the cultural model or the model for the country for the Chinese is the three dynasties. Okay? But the three dynasties is definitely not an empire. It's a multi-national, dimensional, and probably also linguistic situation. Okay? And also even in the so-called, in the warring period, we have different writing systems, although we call this Chinese. So the Chinese tend to say that, okay, the modern Chinese try to come back to the Ming Dynasty, to the Han Tang Dynasty, to the so-called pre-Qing, the three dynasties. So what does it mean? It means that it doesn't want to follow the Qing example. They want to follow older examples. So when we talk about the new national culture and probably literary policies, we're confronting these fundamental differences. One is the Qing model. They would say the Qing, they are wise and practical. Okay? They are wise and practical to adopt, okay, the multilinguistic system, like the way the Tibetan, the Uyghur, and the Manchurian themselves. Okay? But on the other hand, they would say that they don't have the real so-called ideas. Okay, they don't have the Tao. Okay, they don't have the true way to integrate people. Now the communists proclaim that, or claim that. Okay, they have the Tao. Okay, they have the so-called 先进社会主义. Okay, they have something that they want to use that to integrate the people in a new way, not just as practical as the Manchurian. And at the same time, of course, they don't believe in the so-called multi-cultural, multi-dimensional system made in China is why. So the key problem now is, okay, how can China maintain her, I would say, unity when if she choose the so-called multilinguistic or multi-dimensional system, like the Qing China, or like to say the European Union. European Union could never be united. Okay? So I would put the guess that in the future, the Chinese will learn from the Manchurian, but while at the same time try to overcome its deficiencies. They would like to go back to the so-called Ming and Han Tang and the Three Dynasties. They still want to search for the Tao, the way to unite the China as a whole. And if you want to unite China as a whole, then it's entirely different from the so-called modern Western models in that you have high respect toward individuality, individual culture, okay? Different language, different gender, different etc. Everything you have to pay great respect to them because it exists as a true individuality. And we know individuality is the key ideas coming from Christianity, as was proposed by the German pietists during the Romanticism. Okay? The Romantic thinker proposed the importance of individuality. Okay? But for China, individuality has never been very important. I would not say unity is the first thing. No, that's not that's my goal. That's what I'm trying to say. They want to maintain the so-called united and peaceful, and at the same time, if possible, pay respect to differences. But however, it's probably not the Qing model. It's the so-called Three Dynasty and the Han model. Okay? So I begin with the modern Chinese doesn't really like the Qing dynasty. Of course, it's wrong for them to so-called dismiss the new Qing history. It is terribly wrong. They made great achievement. Okay? Even traditional historians like Qian Mu would say that the Qing always have their own identity and their own culture. They use their way to do China in a so-called bad way, etc. So, but anyway, they have their own identity, of course. But Qing China is not so-called orthodox China. It could not be the real example. The modern China is searching for a different example. So, but at the same time, they put themselves in a very difficult situation because traditional China was not an empire, but Qing dynasty is an empire. Okay, so you have to combine the two differences into one and search a new Tao, a new way to unite this essentially I would say, culture and multi-linguistic country into one and keep its peace and unity. So that's the challenge of the modern Chinese. That's what I'm trying to say. I wonder whether you could actually go.
Right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Well, this is very rich. The Qing were, of course, not the only conquest dynasty. There have been several others. Right? The Yuan comes to mind, and a lot of the kind of militarized dynasties that we have, between Han and Tang. Right? Lots of these Central Asian originating Xianbei and Hoba and so on. All these other dynasties didn't last as long as the Qing. Didn't leave as distinguished a record of cultural production to read. But nonetheless, they still had this sense of political power being imposed by military force that had to be constantly called on to maintain it. I think the model of Tang, for example, of a very open empire that is multicultural and not feeling particularly threatened by Sogdian merchants or Tuyu Hun musicians or Turkic cultural influences. I think that's a model that's been made very attractive by historians like Valerie Hansen, for example, writing about the open empire. That's her song in particular. So we actually have at least 25 different models of how to run a dynasty over history, and gosh, maybe I should just go back and start reading through all of those histories if I have enough years left. But yes, the model that has the greatest cultural prestige is the one that you're identifying of a common culture that emanates from the central states, right, from the plural 中国, right, and then is accepted outside of them. someone like Zhang Guang, for example, writing, He Wei Zhongguo, this is the solution that he settles on. That the margins are always fluctuating, but the center is steady. But I always wonder what's happening in the commerce between center and margin, right? How many things get absorbed but then obliterated in the spread of the central culture. In my current project, I'm looking for all kinds of works that have survived in languages that are historically attested in areas close to the central states, but that are no longer spoken, like Yue, for example, right? Or the languages of the Dongyi. You have things that are always kind of funny. There are place names that don't make sense to people because they're a relic of a Yue or a Shu, sort of primordial speech that's been erased by the spread of Chinese dialects. One reason that this is not really a problem to think about is that there's no one who will stand up and say, I am a Dongyi, right? Or I am a Barin, because it just, it's not an identity that's available to modern people. Whereas, people standing up and saying, I'm a Tibetan, or also various regional identities to a greater or lesser degree can mobilize people, but those extinct nations no longer can. And as I'm digging around for them, I'm just looking at the language loss, I guess, and feeling a little bit nostalgic for their disappearance. But again, that's certainly not a conquest model necessarily, although in some areas it must have been. It must have been cultural diffusion that proposed advantages to people. A little bit like what happens today in a country like Australia, right? Maybe you grow up in an area where you speak an ancestral language, right? You're an Aboriginal kid. But if you're a smart Aboriginal kid, they'll send you to school where you learn English and you acquire a profession and you move to the city and you're considered a success. But you and your children will no longer be speaking the language of your grandparents. That probably happened a great deal. And I think it would be exaggerating to call that cultural violence, although there is certainly a kind of a shift there that does involve obliteration of some memories. So anyway, to sort of wrap it up, I think the tension between being, as they say over there, a 统一多民族的国家 is a very complicated one, right? Because if you're going to be 多民族, does this involve sacrificing some element of the 统一, of the unity? Or if you're going to be 统一, how much of your 多民族, of your multiculturalism, are you going to, or your multi-ethnicity, are you going to have to sacrifice? And I think this is always a live problem. There's a wonderful kind of ethnography of ethnography done by Tom Mulaney a few years ago, when he went and he found some primary sources about the 调查, about the investigations that led to the creation of the 56 nationalities tables. And it's fascinating to see how people were negotiating the intellectual and political issues. How do you define what a minzu is, what a nationality is? I recommend this book to everybody because it's not a polemical book at all. It's really a work of oral history, but it shows you how these things happen on the ground, right? How people commit to identities and decide for themselves, how much will this identity require me to do these things, and how much can I have that identity and still do some other things, right? So having a sensitivity to those issues, I think, is a great guide to the long historical past of Chinese multiplicity and the search for formulas that can retain that multiplicity in a kind of unity. Thank you.
Just speak as slowly as going to be possible. I'm not about New Qing history. 如果我的理解没有错的话，其实苏教授的整个研究是在谈 comparative study， 是在谈 comparative。这个 comparative 是在 Journal of Humanity 里面，在人文学科里面。那所以新清史其实只是你的一个错误，是你的一个开始。 那我们在这上面琢磨太多，其实对他并不公平。好，可是在这个地方，我到so therefore from a comparativist perspective, I'm really interested to know your take. 我们怎么样在 undergraduate 的教育上面贯穿，就是说 embody and try to bring this comparative perspective into undergraduate education. 因为我除了你刚刚讲的鼓励孩子大一的时候就去，我们外文系有开拉丁文跟希腊文的课，敲门铃说我要学 other than learning more and more foreign language, because that's also part of the difficulty. As Renaissance as we can be, there's a limit of language we can pick up. But a comparative perspective could be, 我怎么讲英文？但是一个比较的观点是可以被培养的。
对。
而且我觉得这个似乎对于不管在美国或者是在台湾，在中文世界的教育都很重要。那我知道你当过3年的这个比较文学学会会长，你 would you shed some light on, I mean, and help enlighten us on how to cultivate this comparative perspective, particularly in undergraduate education?
Sure. 一种方法呢是用跨科系的研究interdisciplinary studies, and using that as a comparative method, right? Because if people are reflecting on even different media, right, like novels and films, and noticing the differences among them, and the kind of technical vocabulary and perspectives that you have to understand either, and then combining them, even within a single language, you're doing something very comparative. And my esteemed colleague, Dr. Slobioba, teaches a wonderful course in comparative methods in the humanities, where, because you can't count on everyone having all the languages, but you can teach the comparative reflex in this way. This I strongly endorse. Some of the teaching that I most enjoy doing at Chicago is with colleagues in the med school, and we teach history of healthcare philosophy, and very practical things. How is healthcare distributed? Who pays for it? And so forth. Teaching this from Plato to the present to an audience that is going to be usually about half medical students and about half people who are going to go into law or social work or something like that. And so, I'm just bringing my humanities toolkit, but showing people how it's very important to be able to read these texts in a certain way. And the way you read them has a consequence for people's lives, right? For whether people's lives are going to be deemed worthy of support in healthcare, or whether someone is going to say, no, what really matters is saving money, right? To just put it very brutally. So this kind of thing you can do within a single language, and just being able to line up and contrast the viewpoints, or the ways of producing an object, right? The ways that you define a concept historically on the one hand, or let's say philosophically on the other. You could come up with projects that require you to do those two things and then somehow combine them. I think if you can get students to do that, they're performing the same comparative work, and then maybe you can tempt them into learning some languages, because you can say, if you liked that sensation you just felt, another good way to do it is to learn a foreign language. So anyway, for me, this is what makes it all exciting, right? Finding ways to look at things from different points of view and not just repeat.
Yes. Mine is actually almost like a paraphrase of Professor Song's question. I'm not sure if there's, in this room, if there's anyone from the Department of Chinese Literature, and it's not that I can speak for them, but if you were to reorganize the Department of Chinese Literature, what would you do?
What would I do?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
if there is going to be only one textbook in that classroom, would it be the comparative history of literature? I'm sorry, what is the title of the great project?
Well, I think
would that be the
comparative
only
history
textbook you
of
use?
East Asian literatures would be a great book to use as a textbook.
Textbook,
We just need to find some people to write it. But here's a radical proposal, a completely crazy one. But maybe starting with Dunhuang Wenxue. Imagine, because everyone acknowledges that Dunhuang Wenxue is kind of an important branch of Chinese literature learning. It's very diverse, it's very polyglot. And often people read a few Bianwen or a few other documents and say, okay, I've done Dunhuang Wenxue, right? But it's not usually taken as central. And I've been noticing this because I've been reading tons of Chinese literary histories. And usually there's a chapter about Dunhuang, but it's not well connected to the other chapters, right? Whereas, if you're going to write about Saussy, wow, everything, right? Every line has its chu-chu, and everything is connected up to Tang and to Hanfu and so on. Right there, the genealogies are always being emphasized, but Dunhuang is kind of over on the side. So in the spirit of making the marginal central, just in order to shake things up a bit, maybe my Bixiu Ke would be Dunhuang Wenxue. And we'd have some visiting lecturers who are familiar with Tibetan or Sogdian or Indic or something. And that, I think, might frame the whole existence of Chinese literature in a different way. And then we could go back and talk about, the Sandai and the Han and the Tang and so on and forward. But there would have been this moment of experiencing Chinese literature almost from the outside, right? Not from inside the Daotong, but from this kind of peripheral place where things are being mixed up in very different ways. So that would be my first radical solution.
Thank you for your inspiring talk, especially that quotation from Goethe in 1827. But for that sentence, national literature does not mean too much today. I guess our young people will say no, it means a lot to us, especially national history, and either to Taiwanese or you want to say people from ROC or to mainland Chinese. So what I want to say is sometimes national history might against to world history, but sometimes one may not replace with the other. So from the point of view or from the response from mainland Chinese scholars, I guess as outsider, we might understand each other. But going to your field, I want to know more about how the history of the new history of Qing influence or impact on the literature field. Do you think it will help us to rewrite the history of literature, especially in Qing literature? Can you elaborate more on this?
Yes, sure. Well, I think so far, Qing has not had a big influence on literary studies, but I'm sort of urging that it should. And one reason I think that people have been reluctant to take it up is that the really serious people doing Qing have gone and learned Manchu and Mongolian and Tibetan, and that's a hard thing to recommend that people do, and I haven't done it myself. So that's difficult. But to understand Chinese literature as existing in a system of cultural relationships, which is not the only thing, and in which, for somebody, it's connected to these other types of literature, I think that is very useful, right? So, because Chinese literature is so huge that we tend to get in the middle of it, like the famous frogs in a well, and we think it's our whole world. And it will keep you busy, of course, for many lifetimes. There's so much to read and to think about within Chinese literature. But to know that it has a border, and that across that border is something else that's connected to it, I think that's a very useful thing to do. So that's the only sense, by the way, in which I really can endorse Goethe's saying that national literature is sort of done with. I think he's speaking, of course, this is Goethe as a very old man. He's already more or less, with 2 or 3 of his friends, created German literature. And people are always praising him as this kind of hero of national literature, and he's tired of it. And at the moment when he's speaking with his friend Eckermann and makes the remark that I quoted, he had just been reading a Chinese novel, right? Probably Yu Jiaoli, right? Something like that, or one of those Qing, novels of manners. And so he's very impressed by it. That's what prompts him to say, national literature is not the thing, it's world literature. But of course, world literature always supposes that you know what the world is, and I'm sort of urging that the way that Goethe thought about the world, which is mostly as a Europe-centered network of commercial ties, I think that's probably not the best way, or not the only way to think about the world. So it's really having an antidote for the recipes that are usually on offer.
Last question.
Okay, thank you. Talking about comparative literature or comparative literary studies, one of the traditional criticism on doing comparative works on Chinese and so-called Western world literature is that if we want to do, for example, European literary history, it's of course necessary to do the comparative works. Otherwise, you would not know the so-called complex influences between so many European writers and readers. It's basic. But when we talk about traditional Chinese literary history, many would say that, as the example just said, okay, the Dunhuang Dianwen, or this, it looks like an exception. And in most of the cases, the so-called orthodox Chinese literary history goes its own way and were seldom or really influenced by outer influences. I wonder, what's your response to these kinds of criticism as being one of the most leading comparative literary study workers in this field? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I think if you start looking for it, you'll find it. Right? I think if you start looking for outside influence, you'll find it. There's also, of course, a great deal of diversity within early Chinese literature, right? Regional and generic diversity that we tend that literary histories tend to always sort of subordinate to this ongoing narrative in which those different elements are synthesized into something that's more perfect because it's more harmonious and so on. So one way of doing it is just to refuse that gesture of harmonization, and say, no, actually I want to think of Chuzi as being not on the same branch of development with Shijing at all, right? Just to take that example. Although, of course, there's a very long tradition of trying to assimilate those two things with each other. So maybe recognizing those moments where somebody is trying to make the intellectual operation of reconciling difference, maybe you say, I'm not going to reconcile the difference quite yet. I'm going to look for the things that make these sub-traditions separate. So with that, you can also get this effect of comparative literature without necessarily national or linguistic differences. But I think also, we haven't been looking for them long enough, or we haven't really been primed to look for them, but I'm sure there are a lot of cross-border relations and influences that are there once we develop the reflexes to see them. That's what I would bet anyway. So it's just dadu. It's not it's not for sure. Well, I'm keeping people away from their dinner. I just feel that I'm taking my drug right now. There's nothing I like better than conversation with intelligent people, and already you're helping me to understand my little text in a very different way, so that when I go home, I know before I sleep, I'm going to start rewriting it again in response to your wonderful suggestions and ideas. So thank you for that.
What's called, we can also continue our talk on the table, on the dinner table.
I think that's a good idea, especially if there's some beer.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to bring this session to an end because we've been going on about around 2 hours. And anyway, thank you again for this very inspiring talk and your attendance and your nice questions. And I think we all enjoy a very happy afternoon of intellectual exchange.
Thank you.
Thank you.